Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Jalen and today I have my January reading wrap up. So before we get into it, I will share what I'm drinking today. It is a Michigan staple and that is Bell's Two-Hearted Ale. And it's a really good American IPA, 7%, delicious, goes down very smooth. We love it. I know it's distributed nationally in the US, so definitely check it out if you like IPAs. It's very good, highly recommend it. The first book I read this year was Kate Reid Petty's True Story. And so I was really intrigued by this one, by the cover. It basically has 4 different covers. And I knew that this book was about a sexual assault that happens after a college party. And what I was really intrigued by was that it goes through different kind of genres throughout the book. And so it's one part campus novel, one part crime noir, one part psychological thriller horror, and then kind of like a literary fiction spin on all of it. And so I was really excited to check this one out. It's kind of right up my alley. And so this one, it does follow a sexual assault after a college party in which this woman named Alice, she is very drunk and passed out in the backseat of a car, and she's taken home by 2 boys. And she doesn't remember anything of that night. And then those 2 boys begin bragging about what they did to her. And so then she never has any memory of what happened to her. And so she's reckoning with, the rumors that are going on about what happened to her and just, the stigma that comes with being a sexual assault victim. And so she's dealing with that. And as the narrative progresses, we look at different, parts of Alice's life following her time in college. And so one part that I thought was really brilliant was that there's a part of the story that is just basically various drafts of her college admission essays in which she is trying to figure out a way to tell her story, her true story in a sense, and detail something that very traumatic that happened to her in that essay. And you see her advisor, she redlines the essays that she submits to her. So I'll show you an example. So we see feedback from her advisor. When we get to the final product of the essay that she ends up, using to apply to college, it's way, redacted and doesn't really fully go into what happened to her. And I thought it was really interesting in the way that victims' experiences of sexual assault is often censored and minimized and glanced over. And as the narrative keeps going, we see one of the men that was involved in the alleged sexual assault. We see him as an adult and he's an alcoholic, and that part of the story becomes the horror novel in which he's by himself in the woods and he starts to kind of lose his mind. And so that was really interesting as well. And then by the end of it, it all kind of comes together and you learn the true story of what happens. And I thought that was so brilliant the way it was executed at the end. It is an extremely ambitious debut novel from Kate Reid Petty in that she's tackling such a huge, very sensitive topic, obviously, and using these different genres to tell a very unique and original story. And I think this book, I don't want to go into it too much for the sake of spoilers, but I think it's so interesting in the way that it looks at rape culture and the way that this kind of insidious nature of toxic masculinity kind of perpetuates this really, violent and cyclical nature of sexual assault and the way that that impacts victims. And I just thought it was such an incredibly moving story, but also it's very riveting and it keeps you guessing. And I think she does something so original with this book. I do think in terms of some criticisms that I have is that at times it's told in these very long chapters, and it gets very long-winded and exhausting at times to read because there's very minimal chapter breaks. And so yeah, at times I found this a little bit too long, I guess, and I think I could have used a little bit of editing. But however, I think it's really strong and innovative debut novel, and I definitely recommend it. Obviously going in with trigger warnings regarding sexual assault. That's the the basis of this book. But yeah, it was an interesting read for sure to start my reading year. Next, I sadly read my last Ottessa Moshfegh, and it was McGlue. It's her novella. I think this is the first published book of hers, if I remember correctly. I think this was published in 2015. And yes, my last one. I love her so much, and this book is definitely, I think, one of her most unique books in the sense that it's set in 1851, and we follow this sailor named McGlue who wakes up. He's an alcoholic, and he wakes up from basically a bender. He has no recollection of what happened before, but it's alleged that he killed his best friend, Johnson, I think is his name. We kind of follow McGlue as he basically, and he also hit his head, and so he doesn't really remember what happened, and he's dealing with this, foggy brain in terms of, 1, being an alcoholic, and 2, trying to remember what happened to him due to this accident. And again, Ottessa Moshfegh uses a very unlikable hot mess of a narrator, the staple of all of her books and her stories. And I thought this one was really good in that It was interesting seeing Ottessa Moshfegh write kind of like historical fiction. I didn't expect her to dive into that territory. And I thought it was a really impressive and strong debut. She really goes for it in terms of using kind of like the old languagey style, and also given him being like in a drunken fog and accident-induced fog. At times, this book reads somewhat confusingly, but I think she does it intentionally to kind of put you in the brain of McGlue and following him in terms of trying to figure out whether he did what people are alleging him to have done. I think the reveal at the end is so well earned, and I just really loved it. I wouldn't say it's my favorite Ottessa Moshfegh by any means, but I definitely think it's a worthy book in her arsenal. I think she's excellent. I'm very sad that I ran out of books from her, but yeah, this one's very short too. So I would say don't start with this one if you're going to start Ottessa Moshfegh. I think this one is one of her weirder and more difficult to access. I think it's less accessible than some of her other books, but definitely worth your time if you like her. Yeah, this is a fun one. Next, I have my first 5-star read of the year, and that is Jane, a Murder by Maggie Nelson. This is my first Maggie Nelson book, and when I tell you, this book blew my mind. So this book is a mixture of like true crime, memoir, and it tells the story of Maggie Nelson's Aunt Jane, who was murdered in the 60s. So Jane, she was the third in a series of 7 rape murders near University of Michigan in the late 60s. I believe Jane died when Maggie Nelson was 4, and what she does is she tells the story of Jane, and she intersperses portions of Jane's journals throughout this and trying to unpack what happened to Jane and looking at the crime itself. And she looks at the impact that the murder had on her family, and so she kind of mixes memoir, true crime, she uses poetry and prose, and she puts it all like in a blender and creates this absolutely beautiful look at her Aunt Jane, who ended in a very tragic manner. And the thing that I love the most about this book is that through interspersing Jane's diary, we get into her head, and it makes it even more tragic in the sense that we actually get to spend some time with Jane herself rather than just look at the murder. And so it's really an homage, an ode to her aunt. And I found the aunt's passages to be so relatable and so sad. And I don't usually read poetry, and so this was a really great kind of like introduction to poetry for me, and it's in terms of mixing it with some other forms such as prose and newspaper articles. And I just thought it was so beautiful. I highly recommend it if you like true crime or memoir. If you just want a really good, thought-provoking, and emotional read, this one was so good. I can't wait to read more from her. Highly recommend it. I read this one in one sitting too. So yeah, buckle in if you're gonna start this one, because you'll probably finish it in one sitting like I did. It's really hard to put down and just so smart, and I can't wait to reread this one as well. So check it out. Okay, next I have Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro. And this is my first Ishiguro, and I absolutely loved it. This book made me so emotional, and I was not expecting it. I think this book is so interesting in that, so if you don't know what it's about, I know I'm way late to the party on this, so we follow primarily three students at this school called Hailsham. And so these students live at this boarding school, and I don't even want to give too much of the plot away if you don't know what it's about. But basically, you know something's like different with these students, but you don't know what it is. And you follow these 3 students as they traverse their life and figure out who they are and what is so special about them, as their teachers often tell them that they're special and they have a certain purpose. This is a dystopian novel, so I don't want to give anything away. I think this one's best to go into blind, but what I thought this book did so well was that it looks at mortality and really makes you question kind of like the purpose of life and realizing how short life is. And I just thought it was so beautiful and so tragic. This book is sad. Just fair warning. I closed it and I just kind of like stared at my wall, and I was like, geez, that was a lot. Yeah, this is a really good dystopian novel. I cannot wait to read more from him. I just got a proof of his new book coming out in March called Clara and the Sun, and I'm really excited now that I just read this. So one critique I had of this book was that, so it's told from this girl named Kathy's perspective, and one narrative device that he kept using that was so annoying to me was that so Kathy, she says, so before I tell you about this next part, I really feel like I should tell you something about Tommy or something. Or she'll be like, but before we get there, let me tell you this. And she kept like, I just wanted her to tell me the damn story. So that's one minor complaint. If you've read this, you probably know what I'm talking about. But other than that, I thought it was really beautifully written, so smart, made me think a ton. Yeah, which is like what the best dystopian literature does. So recommend this one for sure. Keep your tissues nearby, because I was like very sad by the end of this. Okay, next I read Box Hill by Adam Mars Jones. And this is a very slim novel. I think it's just over 100 pages. And so in short, this book follows this man who is very self-conscious, and it's set in the late 1970s in this like biker community in this cruising spot. And he's gay, and he stumbles over this man, I think it's like in the woods, in a certain town in England. And when he falls over him, he gets into a sexual relationship with this man, and it becomes this very, at times, toxic, dominant and submissive relationship. We follow our narrator, who is very self-conscious and navigating in this, very new space for him and being in a relationship with a man. And this book is incredibly tragic by the end of it, in looking at this man who's trying to discover himself and becoming more assured in what he wants out of life and in his place as a gay man in the late 70s. And I thought this book, while it was incredibly moving at times, I do think it lost some steam after the climax of the novel. I remember the last 20 or so pages, I was a little bit kind of like, where's this going? Or maybe even the last 40 pages, it was a little slow moving at the end there. But I do think this was an interesting look at something I never read about, which is the biker community in England in the late 1970s. And it's a gay novel, and it was just a really cool amalgamation of those topics. And yeah, I thought it was interesting. Wasn't my favorite. It kind of didn't stick with me too much, but I do think it's worth your time if you want to read about that premise, basically. This book gets very dirty and sexual at times. So yeah, it gets pretty steamy, but yeah, it wasn't my favorite, but I do think it's worth your time if it sounds good to you. Okay, next I have Conditional Citizens by Laila Lalami. This is a nonfiction kind of memoir, personal essay, and well-researched collection in which Laila Lalami, she looks at citizenship in the US and unpacks different aspects of it, including faith, assimilation, borders, and she looks at all of these through some personal stories of herself, and also just kind of, critiquing the Trump administration and even before that, and just looking at the problems that come with white supremacy and its influence on citizenship and the way that that creates anyone who's not a white person. It makes them a conditional citizen and limits their ability to operate to the fullest extent as allegedly promised by US citizenship. And I thought it was so interesting and really kind of blew my mind. Citizenship is one topic that I haven't done too much research on before, and so I was really interested to learn more about it and see kind of some more nuance on the topic. And I think she does this beautifully in this essay collection. I think it's so smart and it's so sharp and clear and very easy to understand. It's very well researched and synthesized in a very compact volume, and I just thought it was so good. I really want to read her fiction now. I think she's an excellent, clear, and very persuasive writer on all of these topics. And I thought this book ended on a very hopeful note in which she basically argues that equal citizenship is something that we should always be striving for. And she does admit that while this is something that we probably won't see in our own lifetimes, it's something that is absolutely worth pushing for and identifying and addressing through dismantling white supremacy, bit by bit, basically. And yeah, I thought it was a really hopeful look at this, despite many of the shortcomings that citizenship currently has in the US. But yeah, very, very smart book, very convincing and illuminating, and just I learned so much from it. So highly recommend it. All right, next I have a short story collection called The Office of Historical Corrections by Danielle Evans. I was so excited to read this book because I had watched some Laura Vandenberg interviews, and she's been in frequent discussion with Danielle Evans regarding the short form in recent interviews as their books both came out in 2020. And this book is so good. I think Danielle Evans is she's a brilliant short story writer in the sense that, similarly to Laura Vandenberg, they used the minimal space provided to them to the fullest extent. And both Laura Vandenberg and Danielle Evans have a really beautiful way of throwing twists and turns and surprising the reader at the most unexpected of moments. So all the stories are very unique. They're all based on the topic of kind of like the historical record, and in looking at history and the historical record and what truth means in history and the way that impacts kind of how we perceive our current present moment. And these stories look at this topic of history, determining what the truth is and whether it matters, whether we know exactly what the truth is, all under the general themes of race and class and also grief, and navigating those spaces. And every single one of them was so surprising. She throws so many crazy turns and twists in these stories that I'd be shocked if you read these and you weren't similarly shocked as I was. This book smartly addresses these topics of race and class and history and grief and synthesizes it into a way of looking at whether history is embraced or set aside and why that decision is often made, depending on various factors. Yeah, I highly recommend this collection if you like short stories or if you want a good intro to them. I think each one here is so surprising and so worth your time, and it's just really, really well done. Yeah, recommend it for sure. Okay, on a much different note, I have a thriller, which I rarely read. It is The Push by Ashley Audrain. This book, I thought it was so good. I haven't had a really good thriller in a long time, and so I was very excited to read this one. So this one follows this woman named Blythe who has a daughter named Violet, and She senses that something is off with Violet in the sense that she is a very difficult child. She's often unsatisfied, yet she is very drawn to her father, who doesn't see anything wrong with the daughter Violet. And you learn more about Blythe's history and her own struggles with her mother and her mother's mother, and the way the cyclical nature of basically poor parenting has on Blythe, and her worries about being a good mother, and whether something is wrong with her child or whether it's her own traumas being reflected in her motherhood now. And so eventually Blythe has another kid, and this is a son, and she's immediately drawn to him and she thinks he's the best child. And that eventually causes even more of a rift between her and Violet. Her husband thinks that basically she is just being cruel to the daughter, doesn't see what she's saying, is basically gaslighting her, which is frustrating to read. But as you get further and further into this book, there are constant twists and turns throughout this, and she plays with the reader and makes you think, is Violet actually something wrong with her, or is Blythe just kind of imagining these things, or is she being basically a poor mother? But as you go farther and farther into this story, things get way more complex and sinister as they go on. And I'll leave it there, but this book is so good, so surprising. I could not put it down. This one is very dark, though, which I wasn't expecting. And so, yeah, if you want a dark, thrilling, suspenseful read about motherhood and grief, I would definitely pick this one up. All right, next I have God, I Feel Modern Tonight by Cohen. This one comes out on February 2nd in the US, kindly sent to me by the publisher. And so Cohen, she is a stand-up comedian, and these poems are often just very, they're funny, millennial, smart, sad girl vibes throughout the entire collection. I think it's so funny. It's very quick. You can read it in like 30 minutes, I want to say. It's a very slim collection, but it was really fun. Basically just millennial poetry that's funny, witty. I don't have too much to say about it, but I thought it was really, really good. If you like poetry, I would definitely check this out. Also, I love this cover. Very pretty. Yeah, this is a good one. I liked it. My last two books of January were two of my favorite that I read this year. They're both so good. Oh, I love them so much. Okay, all right, I will start with Fake Accounts by Lauren Oyler. Man, you guys, this book, it's seriously like a knockout debut novel. So this one follows a woman who snoops through her boyfriend's phone and finds out that he is a very right-wing conspiracy theorist on Instagram, which doesn't really reflect his personal views that she has known him to have. And so when she identifies this, she kind of questions everything, and the story goes from there. I'll leave it there. That's all you really need to know about this one. But this book is so smart in that it's kind of tackling internet culture and the facades that we put on when we make our various profiles on the internet, and the way that internet culture kind of also blends into our everyday life, and how it's kind of just completely ingrained in every single aspect of ourselves and our day-to-day kind of perceptions of where we want to go and how we present ourselves to others. And I think it's so interesting the way that she looks at this and dissects it in such a brilliant way. This book is incredibly meta, following a narrator that is very unlikable, but also very self-aware and witty. So I actually kind of liked her, and she also very much resembles Lauren Oyler's personal life, but this is not autofiction. She has clarified that in a recent profile. But this book is so smart in that it's also looking at the way that stories are told and questions kind of what a novel can be. I would say that this book is way less plot focused rather than it serves as criticism in a way. Lauren Oyler is known for her criticism of mostly fiction, but other topics as well. And you can definitely see her taking that reputation of being a critic and applying it to a novel and kind of dissecting the novel itself while also looking at these various themes that are very pervasive in our present moment. And so, yeah, I thought it was so good. It's so funny, so self-aware, so meta. It blew my mind. I need to read this one more time to fully let it sink in, and I really want to. I'm eager to pick this one back up because I thought it was so brilliant. But yeah, definitely take a stab at this one if you want some internet-y, millennial-y, just very smart, self-aware goodness. I just thought it was so good in this cover. I mean, purchase this book just to have this on your shelf because it's magnificent. I'm really excited to see more discourse on this book. I think it's going to be very polarizing, understandably, but I think it's brilliant. So yeah, check it out. Alrighty, and finally, oh my god, I love this book so much. It's Milkfed by Melissa Broder. I just finished this one yesterday, and I loved it so much. We follow Rachel, a woman who has a pretty severe eating disorder, and as the novel opens, we learn more about this eating disorder and kind of how it was pressed upon her by her pretty terrible mother, who constantly questioned whatever she was eating when she was growing up, constantly made her feel self-conscious about her weight and her appearance. And she works in LA at a talent management agency, working a very kind of boring 9-to-5. And the way that she kind of centers herself and gains control is through her eating. And counting calories to a very detrimental effect. So she's going to therapy, and her therapist tells her that she should stop communicating with her mother for 90 days, go like on a detox from her, tries to attempt to resolve her eating disorder in the terms of figuring out how she views herself. Meanwhile, Rachel often goes to this froyo place by her work, and one day she is served by a woman who she is very attracted to. So Rachel tells the froyo worker basically, just fill my cup up to the rim, don't overflow it or anything. And Miriam, the worker, she does not listen to her. She seems intent on giving her a really good froyo sundae. And Rachel is very compelled to Miriam, and she ends up kind of breaking out of her eating disorder through constant communication with her and asking her to go out with her. And it's unclear whether Miriam is reciprocating sexually or whether she just wants to be friends. But it kind of goes from there, and you see Rachel evolve through this love story of sorts. And I thought it was so brilliant in looking at faith and identity and the ways that our childhood trauma kind of play upon our present moment, and navigating through that space and trying to find yourself through love, basically. And I thought it was so beautiful. At times, this book, it's very graphic sexually, and often Melissa Broder, she's not afraid to go there with her descriptions of anything. I think Melissa Broder rides a fine line of being a little too much at times, but I thought it was so brilliantly done. I love this book so much. I cannot wait to read more from her. I just had such a good time. I was very invested in the story. I could not put it down. I think this is a very funny book. It's obviously triggering in the sense that it covers very in-depth the minutia of having an eating disorder, and I think she puts that on full display to really good effect for the reader. But I do think this one's very funny. There's a lot of Jewish humor in here, which I loved. It's so funny. Check this one out. Obviously, with trigger warnings for eating disorders. This one's out on February 2nd. It's like a good romance novel. I don't really read romance, but this is one that I really vibe with. So yeah, check it out. Alrighty, that about does it for my reading of January. I had a really good reading month, I think. I really liked a lot of what I read this month. But yeah, until next time, cheers.